The first time Claire Whitmore drove back into Ashford, Montana, it felt like the whole town was watching her. Maybe it was just her imagination. After all, years had passed since she'd last lived here, but there was something about the way the evening sun slanted across the rooftops, the way the breeze rustled the cottonwoods along Main Street, that made her feel as though time had held her in place while everything else had moved on. She parked her old sedan outside the only diner still open, the Maple and Iron, a small-town staple with its neon sign buzzing faintly in the twilight. It smelled of fried onions and black coffee even from the outside. She hadn't eaten all day, but food was only an excuse. What she really needed was to sit still, breathe, and convince herself she hadn't made the wrong decision coming back here. Inside, the bell above the door chimed, and she caught the faintest pause in conversation. A few men in work boots looked up from their plates. A teenage girl behind the counter tilted her head curiously, and the jukebox in the corner hummed an old country tune. Claire forced a polite smile, but her heart beat faster than she wanted to admit, because she knew if she stayed long enough, if she let the night unravel the way nights in Ashford always did, she'd see him again. Ellie Mercer. The name itself stirred something buried deep in her chest, something she had worked for years to silence. He was the boy who once walked beside her along the riverbank, the boy who had taught her how to ride an old motorcycle behind his father's barn, the boy who had one summer night held her in the forest when they were both too lost, too scared, and too young to understand the weight of what they were doing. And then he was the boy she left behind when her family moved her to the city, leaving that night between them like a ghost that never stopped breathing. Now, years later, she was back, for reasons she hadn't dared tell anyone yet. She slid into a booth by the window. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around the chipped porcelain mug the waitress set down. Coffee. Bitter, hot, familiar. For a moment, she stared at her reflection in the glass, the woman she had become. Older, yes, stronger maybe, but still carrying the ache of that unfinished story. And then, as if the past had been listening for its cue, the door opened. Boots thudded against the worn linoleum. The room shifted. Claire didn't need to look up to know who it was. Ellie Mercer. He hadn't changed in the ways she expected. Taller, broader, sun-worn in the way only years of outdoor work could carve into a man's skin. His hair was shorter, his jaw sharper, but his eyes, those steady, unshakable blue eyes, were exactly the same. And the moment they landed on her, she knew everything she had tried to bury was about to rise again. Eli froze in the doorway for half a breath longer than most men would. To anyone else, it might have looked like nothing, just another ranch hand pausing before finding a seat. But Claire saw it. She had always been attuned to the smallest flickers in him, the little hesitations he never admitted. Their eyes locked. It was as if the years between them collapsed into a single second. The diner, the voices, the jukebox, all faded. For that heartbeat of silence, Claire wasn't the woman who had been away, and Eli wasn't the man who had stayed. They were just two people remembering the same night beneath the same stars long ago. Eli blinked, and the spell broke. He gave a small nod, barely more than a tilt of his chin, before heading to the counter. He didn't speak to her, didn't walk over. Instead, he ordered coffee in that low, gravel-threaded voice that still sounded like summer nights by the river. Claire's hand tightened around her mug. She told herself to stay calm, to act as though nothing mattered, but she could feel the blood in her ears, the restless pull inside her chest. She had come back to Ashford for practical reasons she wasn't ready to admit even to herself. But fate had shoved Eli into the picture before she'd had time to steady her footing. The waitress, a sharp-eyed girl who couldn't have been more than 17, looked between them curiously. She leaned toward Eli with a smile that was more teasing than polite. "Haven't seen you in here this late in a while. Guess the ranch doesn't keep you too busy tonight?" Eli gave a non-committal grunt, sipped his coffee, and slid a glance toward Claire. Just a glance, but it was enough. She looked down quickly, pretending to study the sugar packets in their little glass holder. She remembered a time when he would have walked straight over, dropped into the booth across from her, and asked about her day with that easy warmth he carried. Now there was a distance in him, something heavier, more guarded. Minutes passed, but Claire couldn't leave it there. She knew if she got up and walked out, the weight of not speaking to him would follow her worse than any memory. So she gathered the kind of courage that had nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with longing. She stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked toward him. Her voice came out softer than she intended. Eli. He looked up, and for the first time, he let the corner of his mouth twitch into what could almost be called a smile. Not the carefree grin she remembered, but something quieter, edged with disbelief. Claire. Just her name, but the way he said it was enough to undo her. For a moment, neither of them moved. The years hung between them like dust caught in the late summer sunlight through the diner window. She thought about turning, retreating, sparing herself. But she couldn't. Not now, not after hearing her name in his voice again. Can I? She gestured vaguely to the empty stool beside him. Sit? Eli studied her a moment, then gave the smallest nod. Sure. And just like that, the past cracked open, and the first words of a long unfinished conversation began to spill into the present. The stool squeaked as Claire lowered herself beside him. She folded her hands on the counter, but her fingers fidgeted, betraying the steadiness she tried to wear. For a moment, neither spoke. The waitress came by, poured more coffee into Claire's mug without asking, and wandered off again, leaving the silence heavy between them. Eli broke it first. His voice was rough, the kind of roughness that came from long days in the cold wind and nights where words weren't needed. Didn't think I'd see you back here. Claire breathed in slowly. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her head during sleepless city nights, but rehearsals always crumble in the face of reality. I didn't think I'd be back, she admitted, her eyes fixed on the dark swirl of her coffee. But things change. Eli gave a low hum, not quite agreement, not quite challenge. She could feel his eyes on her, measuring the truth inside her words. You here for long? He asked. The question was simple, but the weight behind it wasn't. He wasn't just asking about time. He was asking if she would stay, if she would let Ashford and him back into her bones. I don't know, Claire said quietly. Depends. On what? She hesitated, then turned her head to look at him. Really look. His face was more weathered than she remembered, carved with lines the years had written, but his eyes were still the same, a gray blue that could cut and comfort at once. On whether it feels like home again, she whispered. That earned her the faintest flicker of something in his expression, maybe recognition, maybe pain, she couldn't tell. The memory rose unbidden. That night years ago, when they had both been too young to know how deep a single choice could run, lost in the woods during the camping trip, the panic fading into laughter, the laughter breaking into silence, and then one kiss, reckless and unplanned, unfolding into something neither of them could ever quite forget. Claire swallowed, pressing the memory down where it belonged. But Eli must have been carrying the same ghost because his next words came slow, deliberate. Funny thing about home, sometimes it ain't the place that changes, sometimes it's us. The truth of it cut through her. She wanted to say something, to reach across the counter and touch his hand the way she used to imagine, but her courage failed. Instead, she lifted her mug, took a sip, and murmured, Maybe. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of the past, of unspoken questions, of the kind of pull that no passing years could weaken. And Claire realized, with a slow ache, that this wasn't just a chance encounter. This was the start of something she had both dreaded and needed for far too long. The cafe had thinned out by the time they finished their coffee. The murmur of conversation had dwindled, replaced by the clink of dishes being stacked in the kitchen. Outside, the Montana sky had turned a heavy gray, the kind that pressed low and threatened snow. Claire pulled her coat tighter, but she didn't rise. Eli hadn't moved either. Both seemed caught in the quiet hesitation of people who should leave but don't want to. Finally, Eli shifted. "Truck's parked out back. I can give you a ride." She looked at him, torn between pride and longing. She could easily call for a taxi, pretend she didn't need his help, but something in his tone, flat but not unkind, made her nod. "All right," she said softly. They stepped outside together. The air bit at her skin, sharp and unforgiving, yet it was oddly grounding. Snowflakes had begun to drift lazily from the sky, melting on the dark asphalt of the lot. Eli's old pickup waited near the edge, its paint worn and its body dented by years of use. Claire slid into the passenger seat. The smell inside hit her immediately, faint traces of leather, engine oil, and something else she couldn't place, something that belonged entirely to him. It tugged at her memory in ways that felt dangerous. The engine rumbled to life, and for a while they drove in silence. The road wound past pine forests and stretches of frozen field, the world outside hushed beneath the weight of the coming storm. Claire spoke first this time. "You stayed," she said, almost accusingly. "Somebody had to," Eli replied, eyes steady on the road. "You could have left, gone anywhere, started fresh." His grip tightened on the wheel. "Not everyone's built for leaving." The words stung, though she wasn't sure if they were meant for her. She stared out the window, watching the blur of snow and shadow. "I thought about you," she whispered before she could stop herself. The admission filled the cab, fragile and heavy. Eli's jaw flexed. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without looking at her, he said, "I never stopped." Her breath caught. The storm outside seemed to fade, leaving only the storm between them. She wanted to ask him if he remembered that night, the firelit clearing, the way her hands had trembled against his, but the words lodged in her throat. Some memories were too sacred, too volatile to name aloud. Instead, she sat in silence, heart pounding with the unspoken, as the truck carried them deeper into the quiet of the mountains. The storm grew heavier as they wound farther along the mountain road. Snow streaked across the windshield, each flake caught briefly in the glow of the headlights before vanishing into the dark. Eli's wipers scraped a steady rhythm, the sound filling the silence between them. Claire pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching the world blur white. "I used to think storms like this were beautiful," she said quietly. Eli gave a low hum, almost like agreement, but his eyes stayed on the road. "You don't anymore?" he asked after a moment. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe it's because back then storms felt safe, like the world could shut down, and it was an excuse to stop running." Her voice faltered. "Now they just remind me of how much I lost." The words surprised her, how easily they spilled out, how raw they sounded in the small cab. She hadn't meant to reveal so much. Eli's hand twitched on the wheel, as if fighting the urge to reach for her. Instead, he kept driving. "You didn't lose everything," he said finally, his tone rough. "You're here, aren't you?" Claire turned her head to study him. The set of his jaw, the tired curve of his mouth, the stubborn steadiness of his gaze. He was both familiar and changed, like a song she'd once known by heart but hadn't heard in years. "Eli," her voice softened, "why didn't you ever leave this place?" He exhaled through his nose, the sound heavy. "Because leaving meant letting go of the last thing that mattered." The truth of it landed between them with unbearable weight. Claire's throat tightened. She wanted to ask if he meant her, but she was afraid to hear him say it, or worse, deny it. The truck hit a patch of ice, and Eli steadied it with practiced hands. The jolt brought her back to herself, but her chest still ached from his words. Minutes later, they pulled into a clearing. His cabin stood at the edge of the trees, small and weather-worn, its roof heavy with snow. A single light glowed from the porch, warm against the vast, cold night. Claire hesitated when he cut the engine. The silence pressed in, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. "You can stay here tonight," Eli said, his tone practical, though his eyes flickered with something else. "Roads won't be safe until morning." Her pulse quickened. She knew what stepping inside meant, not just shelter, not just safety, but memory, temptation, danger. Still, she found herself nodding. "All right." Eli opened his door, and the storm rushed in around them. Claire followed, clutching her coat tighter, as if it could shield her from more than the cold. The porch light spilled over them, and for the first time all night she realized she wasn't afraid of the storm outside. It was the one inside her that truly terrified her. The cabin door creaked open, releasing a rush of dry warmth that wrapped around Claire as she stepped inside. The scent of cedar and old books lingered in the air, grounding her in a place that felt untouched by time. Eli set her bag by the wall and moved toward the fireplace. With practiced motions, he stacked logs and struck a match. Flames caught quickly, throwing a golden glow across the room. Shadows danced on the wooden walls, softening the sharpness of his face. Claire stood still, taking it in, the rough-hewn furniture, the shelves lined with worn spines, the faint hum of wind pressing against the cabin. Everything about the space whispered of solitude, of a life lived quietly, away from noise and expectation. "You've built yourself a whole world here," she said softly. Eli gave a small shrug, crouched before the fire. "World's easier when it's small. Less chance of losing something you can't replace." Her chest tightened at the implication. She wanted to ask if he meant her again, but the courage wavered on her tongue. Instead, she slipped off her damp coat and draped it over a chair. Eli rose, brushing ash from his palms. For a moment, they stood facing each other, the fire crackling between them. It cast his eyes in amber, making them look like embers themselves. "I'll make you some tea," he said, turning abruptly toward the small kitchen space. Claire almost reached for him then, almost bridged the gap that years had carved open. But she stopped herself, fingers curling into her palms. As he busied himself with kettle and cups, she wandered toward the shelves. Her hand brushed across the spines of books, familiar and not. One caught her eye, its cover worn, pages yellowed. She pulled it out and felt a pang in her chest. It was the same novel she had once lent him years ago before everything fell apart. She'd forgotten about it, but he hadn't. When Eli returned, setting 2 steaming mugs on the low table, he noticed her holding it. His mouth twitched into the faintest, saddest smile. "You left that behind," he said. "And you kept it," she whispered. Their eyes met across the flicker of firelight, and, for a heartbeat, the years between them dissolved. But then Eli looked away, sinking onto the couch. Some things aren't so easy to throw away. Claire's throat burned. She sat opposite him, wrapping her hands around the mug, though she barely felt its heat. The silence stretched long and fragile, filled with everything they weren't saying. Outside, the storm raged against the windows. Inside, another storm gathered, waiting for one of them to break first. The tea cooled in their hands, untouched. The fire hissed and shifted, filling the silence with a language of its own. Claire stared into the flames, but every flicker carried her back to that night in the woods when she and Eli had been nothing but 2 reckless souls clinging to each other against the dark. She could still feel it, the trembling of his breath against her skin, the heat of his hands, the wild thrum in her chest that told her she had found something rare, and she could still feel the ache of the morning after, when reality pulled them apart before either dared to name what had happened. Her fingers tightened around the mug. "Do you ever think about it?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Eli's gaze lifted slowly, heavy as stone. "Every day," he admitted. Claire's breath caught. The firelight painted his face in shades of confession, stripping away the mask of calm he always wore. "I tried to bury it," he went on, voice rough, "but some things don't stay buried, not when they've carved themselves into you." Her heart raced. She set the mug down, her hands trembling now, not from cold, but from the weight of everything between them. "I thought maybe I was the only one," she whispered. "That night haunted me, and when I left town I told myself it was just a mistake." Eli flinched as if the word cut deeper than she intended. His eyes glinted, not with anger, but with a hurt so old it had fossilized. "A mistake?" His voice was low. "Is that what you call it?" Claire's chest tightened. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "That's what I tried to call it, because it was easier than admitting the truth." The storm outside roared louder, rattling the cabin. Claire leaned forward, her eyes locked to his. "The truth is," she said, her voice breaking, "I've never forgotten, not once, and being here, seeing you again." Her throat closed, her words dissolving into the firelight. For a long, suspended moment, Eli didn't move. Then, with a sharp exhale, he set his mug aside and leaned forward too, closing the space between them. The air thickened, the fire crackled, and Claire realized that after all these years they were standing on the same precipice once more, only this time they both knew exactly what waited if they leapt. The storm pressed against the cabin walls like a restless spirit, but inside, the silence between them carried a different kind of force, one that neither wind nor thunder could drown. Eli's eyes stayed on her, dark and searching. Claire felt pinned beneath them, as if every guarded truth she'd carried for years was suddenly bare. "You don't know how many nights I wanted to tell you," he said, his voice low but urgent. "How many times I thought of writing or driving to the city just to find you. But then I'd remember, you had your life, and I was still here." Claire's chest ached. She reached for the blanket draped across her lap, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was his words, echoing the ones she had never dared to speak. "I kept telling myself you'd forgotten," she whispered, "that I was the only fool holding on to it. But I couldn't let it go, Eli. Every time I closed my eyes, I went back there, back to that night, to you." Eli's jaw clenched as though bracing himself against the tide of her confession. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, dragging a hand down his face. "Do you know what it did to me?" he asked. His tone was raw, stripped bare. "That morning, when you walked away and didn't look back, I thought I was just a chapter you were done reading, and I let myself believe it. I had to, otherwise I'd have gone mad." Her eyes burned. She wanted to reach across the small space between them, to take his hand, to undo the years of silence with a single touch, but fear held her still. "Eli," she said softly, "I didn't walk away because I wanted to. I walked away because I was scared. I was young, confused, and what we shared felt too big for me, too dangerous. It terrified me how much it mattered." The words hung heavy, trembling with the weight of years. The fire cracked, a log collapsing inward, sending a shower of sparks into the chimney. Eli lifted his head, and this time there was no anger in his gaze, only something older, wearier, something that had survived the long winter of waiting. "Then tell me," he said. His voice was a hushed demand. "Now, when there's no more running, no more excuses, what does it matter to you now?" Claire's breath caught, her answer tangled in the storm of her heart. Claire's lips parted, but for a long moment no sound came. She felt the weight of his question press against her chest, heavy and unrelenting. What did it matter now? Everything. And yet, saying it aloud meant there was no going back. Finally, her voice broke through the storm inside her. It still matters, Eli. More than it should. More than I can admit without feeling like I've betrayed the life I chose after I left here. But none of it erased what we had. Nothing ever did. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together in her lap. The memory of his touch, the way the forest had swallowed their breath that night years ago, it all came rushing back with a force that left her dizzy. Eli leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on her like a man clinging to the last light before darkness. "Do you have any idea how many times I wanted to hear you say that?" he asked. "Even just once? You were my first thought every morning, my last thought at night. And when the storms came, like tonight, I'd swear I could still feel you beside me." Claire swallowed hard, her throat tight. "And yet, we let the years slip by," he nodded slowly. "Because I thought you didn't want me." The words sliced through her. All the years she had convinced herself she was protecting him by staying away, that he'd be better without the chaos of her indecision. Those years now lay bare as wasted time. "Eli," she said, her voice trembling, "I never stopped wanting you. I just didn't know how to want you and still be brave enough to face it." For the first time that night, he reached across the space and took her hand. His grip was steady, warm, grounding her in the moment. Claire closed her eyes, and a tear slid free, tracing her cheek like a line of surrender. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, something fragile and long buried had begun to stir back to life. The storm pressed harder against the cabin walls, rain thrashing like restless hands on old wood. Inside, time seemed to hold its breath. Claire's hand rested in Eli's, and though it was just skin against skin, it carried the weight of years unsaid. "I thought leaving would free me," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the hiss of rain. "I thought the city, the noise, the constant motion would erase what I carried, but it never did. Every quiet moment, every lonely night, you were still there." Eli's thumb brushed over her knuckles, tender, reverent. His eyes shone in the dim lamplight, shadows cutting sharp across his face. "You don't know how many nights I wondered if I should have run after you," he said. "If I should have left everything behind to bring you back." Her chest ached, a deep pull that felt almost unbearable. "Would you have?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes, 1,000 times yes, but I was too proud and too afraid you'd only push me away harder." Claire felt her composure fracture, the thin armor she'd worn for years dissolving under the warmth of his gaze. She wanted to hide, to bury herself in the safety of silence, but the truth pressed against her like the storm pressing on the cabin. "I was scared," she confessed, her voice breaking. "Scared of how much I loved you. Scared it would consume everything else I thought I wanted." The words hung heavy between them. Eli leaned closer, his voice low, almost a whisper. And now, Claire's breath caught. She searched his face, the lines carved by years of waiting, the steadiness in his eyes that hadn't wavered even after all the lost time. Slowly, she lifted her other hand, resting it against his cheek. "Now," she said, her throat thick with emotion. "I'm more afraid of losing you again than of anything else in this world." The storm groaned overhead, but neither of them heard it. Their world had shrunk to this. 2 hands joined, 2 hearts laid bare, the unspoken finally spoken aloud. The cabin was swallowed in silence, and the kind that trembles just before something changes forever. The fire had burned low, casting amber light that flickered across Claire's face. Her hand lingered on Eli's cheek, and though she meant only to touch, her fingers trembled as though afraid of the distance that might return if she let go. Eli leaned into her touch, his breath warm against her palm. "Claire," he began, but his voice faltered. There were so many words fighting inside him, years of regret, years of longing, but none felt enough. So instead, he let his forehead rest gently against hers. The closeness broke something open in her. She could feel the steadiness of his heartbeat, the unspoken promise that had lived between them all this time. Her own heart answered, frantic, as though afraid of being too late. "I shouldn't," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of hesitation. But her body betrayed her, leaning closer, her lips hovering just a breath away from his. "You don't have to stop," Eli said, his voice rough, steady. "Not this time." The storm outside wailed, wind lashing at the windows, but inside, their restraint finally shattered. Claire closed the space between them, her lips finding his in a kiss that carried all the years they had lost. It wasn't gentle, it was raw, aching, desperate, a confession in itself. When she pulled back, her breath unsteady, tears shimmered at the edges of her eyes. "Do you realize what this means? There's no going back." Eli's hands framed her face, tender but firm, grounding her in the moment. "I don't want to go back, not to silence, not to pretending. If this is all we have, even for one night, I'll take it." Her chest tightened at his words, a mixture of fear and fierce longing. She had spent so long running from this, but now, in the small cabin surrounded by rain and memory, she realized there was nowhere left to run. Claire let out a shaky breath and pressed her forehead back against his. "Then stay with me. Just stay." And for the first time in years, Eli didn't have to wonder if she meant it. The rain beat against the roof with relentless force, a steady drum that seemed to echo the rhythm of their hearts. Claire's breath trembled in her chest, and Eli could see the storm in her eyes, not outside, but within her. She had always been strong, always composed, but now all the carefully built walls were falling apart. His hands lingered at her shoulders, hesitant for just a moment. He wanted to be sure, more sure than he had ever been. "Claire," he murmured, searching her gaze, "if you tell me to stop, I'll stop. But I can't pretend anymore." Her lips quivered, torn between fear and the aching need she could no longer deny. "I don't want you to stop," she admitted, her voice breaking like the first crack of thunder. Those words undid him, the years of silence, the stolen glances, the half-formed sentences that never found the courage to live. They all came rushing into this single moment. Eli pulled her into his arms, holding her as though the storm might tear her away if he let go. Their mouths met again, this time slower, deeper, carrying not only passion, but the tenderness of everything unsaid. His fingers brushed through her hair, and she clung to him, anchoring herself in the only truth she could trust, him. When the kiss broke, she rested her head against his chest, listening to the solid, steady rhythm beneath her ear. For the first time in years, she felt safe, not in the cabin, not in the storm, but in Eli. "I've thought about this night," she confessed softly, her words muffled by the fabric of his shirt. "Even when I tried to forget you, even when I told myself it was wrong." Eli pressed his lips to the crown of her head. "So have I. Every day. Every time I pass the places we once walked together. You've never left me, Claire." Tears welled up, but they were no longer just of sorrow. They were release. The burden of denial was lifting piece by piece, replaced by the fragile, dangerous beauty of truth. Outside, the rain poured harder, as if the world itself wanted to wash away all the years they had lost. Inside, Claire tilted her face upward once more, her eyes glistening. "Then don't let me go this time," she whispered, and Eli, with a certainty that felt like breathing, answered, "Never again." The cabin felt smaller now, not because of its 4 wooden walls, but because every corner seemed filled with the intensity of what was happening between them. The storm outside faded into background noise, a steady hum that only made the silence between their words louder, heavier, charged. Claire's fingers trembled as she reached for Eli's face, tracing the familiar lines she once knew so well. Time had aged him, subtly, gently, but her touch was reverent, almost disbelieving, as if she feared he might disappear the moment she blinked. "You're real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Eli caught her hand and pressed it to his chest, where his heartbeat raced wildly. "More real than anything I've ever known. More real than the years I spent pretending I could live without you." Her breath caught, and for the first time she allowed herself to smile through the tears. A smile of surrender, of finally letting go of fear. When he leaned down to kiss her again, there was nothing rushed about it. It wasn't the desperate reunion of two lost souls anymore. It was slower, deeper, filled with the weight of years they had lost, and the promise of never wasting another. The way he touched her was careful, reverent, as though she was something sacred, and for Claire, every brush of his hand felt like he was rewriting the story of her life, erasing the loneliness that had clung to her for so long. The fire crackled, throwing soft, flickering shadows against the cabin walls. Claire closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the warmth of his embrace. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was running or hiding or enduring. She simply felt alive. When the rain finally softened into a gentle drizzle, she lay with her head against Eli's shoulder, their fingers intertwined. The silence was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. "I don't know what tomorrow holds," she murmured, almost afraid to disturb the fragile stillness. "But tonight, I don't regret anything." Eli kissed her hair and held her tighter. "Then let's not think about tomorrow. Let's just be. Tonight is ours." And for once, she believed it. She allowed herself the impossible luxury of belonging, not to the past, not to fear, but to him, here and now. Morning crept into the cabin in quiet shades of gray. The storm had passed, leaving behind the faint scent of wet earth and pine drifting through the cracks in the wooden walls. Claire stirred awake, the weight of warmth beside her grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. Eli was already awake. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling beams, his hand still loosely wrapped around hers, as if he had been afraid she might slip away during the night. When she opened her eyes fully, their gazes met. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was tender, yet edged with something fragile, the undeniable truth that dawn always demanded answers night could postpone. Claire sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The reality of what they had done, what they had chosen, pressed against her chest. It wasn't regret she felt, but a deep, aching awareness. "Eli," her voice wavered, "we can't stay here forever." He propped himself up on one elbow, watching her carefully. "I know, but for once, can we stop thinking about what we can't do and start thinking about what we want?" Her lips parted, but no words came. She wanted to tell him she was tired of hiding, tired of living in fragments, yet there was a lifetime of responsibility behind her, the family she had left, the town that remembered every choice she made. Eli reached for her hand again. "Last night wasn't a mistake, Claire. You know that as well as I do." She looked at him, eyes glistening, torn between fear and longing. "No, it wasn't a mistake, but it changes everything." He gave a small, sad smile. Maybe everything needed to change. The words settled between them, heavy but true. Outside, the world was washed clean by the rain, bright with the fragile hope of a new day. Inside the cabin, two people sat with their hearts bare, knowing that love had found them again, but also knowing that love came with a cost. Claire finally exhaled, the breath shaky but freeing. "Then I guess the question is, are we brave enough to pay it?" Eli's answer was simple. He leaned forward, pressed his forehead against hers, and whispered, "For you, always." By the time Claire and Eli stepped out of the cabin, the storm had left only silver puddles scattered along the dirt path. The mountains loomed, quiet witnesses to what had happened between them. The air smelled of rain and pine, clean, almost merciless in its clarity. They walked without speaking for a while. Each step toward the main road was a reminder that the world outside still existed, full of expectations, whispers, and obligations that neither of them could completely escape. Claire clutched her jacket tighter around her. "People will never understand," she murmured. Eli's voice was calm but steady. "Let them talk. They've never lived in our hearts. They don't know what it costs to keep breathing in silence." She glanced at him, her throat tight. "And what if the cost is too high? What if we lose everything?" He stopped walking. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he turned to face her fully. "Claire, haven't we already lost enough? You've spent years carrying other people's expectations. I've spent years pretending I didn't love you. At some point, we either choose ourselves or we disappear." Tears welled in her eyes. She wanted to be strong, but his words pierced through the walls she had built around herself. "You make it sound so simple." Eli reached out, brushing his thumb against her cheek, drying a tear before it could fall. "It's not simple. It's terrifying, but it's real." The world seemed to pause around them, the dripping leaves, the distant call of a bird, the stillness of the mountain air. In that quiet, Claire realized the truth. Love was never about perfection. It was about choosing, again and again, even when the choice hurt. She let out a shaky breath, then nodded. "Then let's choose, no matter how the world looks at us, no matter what we lose." Eli's face broke into a quiet, disbelieving smile. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if the storm might come back any moment to tear them apart. And for the first time in years, Claire felt light. Not because the path ahead was easy, but because it was theirs. When they finally reached the road, the sun broke through the clouds, laying a soft gold across the wet asphalt. It wasn't a promise of happily ever after. It was simply a beginning. They didn't let go of each other's hands. Not this time.